So, as I was saying, welcome to the third lecture of our lecture series, the Future of European Geostrategy. As you may know, the series is organized by the Institute for European Studies of the Free University of Brussels and the Egmont Institute. And the objective of the lecture series is to sort of reflect upon Europe's evolving role in a very rapidly changing and challenging international context. So we started a couple of weeks ago with a general overview on the future of European foreign policy by Sir Robert Cooper, and that was followed by a lecture last week on the evolving geopolitical and security situation in Eastern Europe post-Crimea in the context of what's going on in Ukraine by Michael Ruhle from NATO. And today we're going to move on to the Middle East, Europe's southern flank or southeastern flank in this case, because we're going to be focusing pretty much on what's going on in Iraq, Syria, Mesopotamia, rather than North Africa, which we will cover in 2 weeks' time. So we all know that Syria and Iraq are very much in the news these days, especially in the context of the rise of the so-called Islamic State. But what we're going to try to do here today is try and place the conflict that those two countries are experiencing in sort of a broader context by looking at the region's evolving geopolitical and security dynamics. So we're going to talk about Iran's role in the region. We're also going to talk about Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and so we're going to try and look at the also at the implications of an increasingly contested regional environment for the West and for Europe in particular. And to tackle all these very difficult and fascinating questions, we have a great expert on the Middle East, Dr. Judith Yaphe. Dr. Yaphe is an adjunct professor at the Elliott School of International Affairs at GW University, George Washington University, and she's also the Middle East project director in the Institute for National Strategic Studies at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. And before joining the National Defense University, which she did in 1995, Dr. Yaphe served for 20 years as a senior analyst on Middle Eastern and Persian Gulf issues in the Central Intelligence Agency. She is the recipient of the Intelligence Medal of Commendation, and she is also the author of many books and articles on the Middle East. She often briefs senior U.S. foreign policy officials and has testified before congressional committees on Iraq and regional strategic issues. So Dr. Yaphe is going to speak for about an hour, and after that we'll open up the discussion to bring in any questions or comments you may have. And after the discussion, you'll invited to a reception right outside. So without further ado, Judith, thanks again for accepting our invitation, and welcome to Brussels. The floor is yours.
Whoops, the floor? I'll take it home. Thank you very much. I want to thank the Institute and your partner organizations for inviting me. Brussels has always been one of my favorite places to stop, and I'll go from here to Mary's for my chocolate afterwards, just to show you I'm familiar a little bit with Brussels. Thank you for that warm introduction, and some of it was even right. I did test run some of this briefing, especially these slides, with an innocent group before I came here, just to see if they tracked or not. I've done this a couple of times. It's complicated in the beginning. But again, there's nothing about the Middle East which is simple. And I've often thought, and I've covered this area probably longer than you've been born or lived. I've been around a while. And I have never seen the region so complicated, with so many issues, all of which are a disaster in one way or the other, and most of which do have some kind of connection. If you start to pull at one issue, pretty soon you have pulled on almost everything around it. There is a connection. So what I would like to do in the time I have, and I don't want to over-talk, because I know how hard it is to sit through long and possibly boring presentations, but this won't be boring, trust me. But the other thing is, I'd like to start with an overview of the confusion. And I am sure that much of the heart of what we're where the interest is what is the U.S. doing or not doing? Why is there so much confusion? And what is expected of the region? I tend to look at it from a regional perspective. I always have. But you look at it from the place where you are sitting. And one has to keep that in mind. If you think, though, and I wanted to just sort of say a few things in the beginning, that if there is confusion about President Obama and where the policy is going, I think in part it's because you spend too much time listening or spending time on social media listening to U.S. politics. We have an election in about 3 weeks now, 2 weeks, whatever. I pay a lot of attention to that detail. And the problem is we've been living through, almost 6 years of constant criticism of the administration. And I think you understand that so much of it is political and personal, and politicians at home, especially in the past several years, will take any issue and beat it to death if it harms or if it raises questions about the capabilities of the other side. But when I think about Mr. Obama, I'm remembering one special thing. If there is confusion, if there is uncertainty, what do you do if, when you become President of the United States, the first thing that happens to you is that you get the Nobel Peace Prize? What do you do after that? And how will you end 8 years of your presidency by saying, in the beginning, I promised you peace, and in the end, I've given you war, or something short of that? So I think that gives you a little bit of a difficulty, plus in balancing what are interests and in living with the very real memory of his predecessor administration, which did take us to war for reasons that are still hard to fathom. I could not explain to you. I hope somebody does not ask me, why did you go to war in 2003? I've only covered this area for, I don't want to tell you how long, but a long time. And I will never be able to answer that. And I was living in the middle of it. But what I want to do is talk about what I call red herring issues. I don't know how many of you follow mystery stories. I'm a great murder mystery person, especially European murder mysteries. And I always look for the false lead. You know, they want to take you, distract your attention. Politics is like that. But looking at the Middle East can be that as well. What I want to do is look at if there are a few assumptions out there or explanations that I think you have to put aside. One of them is this issue on, it's all about Sykes-Picot. Does anybody remember that even? I mean, I have students who don't remember. It's a horror to me, of course, the Vietnam War. What was that? Well, they weren't born then. How could they? But when you think about it, it's 100 years since the First World War, the anniversary of the First World War, and we are still fighting this. It doesn't matter is my answer. But it's one of those things which is a false trail, and I can explain why. Some people still think about the Arab Spring or maybe the Arab Winter, but I think we have to go beyond that. What we are seeing, I think, is a return to the kind of, and I would call it, if you want to be very au courant, authoritarianism 2.0, that we're seeing a return to military or militarism, the militarization of politics, and a return to authoritarianism in most of the states of the region, especially those that had experienced and in which we all had high hopes for change. It was the beginning of what was going to be a glorious future. Right. I want to talk about as well the new sectarianism. Everybody talks about it, but nobody knows what it is. And yet sectarian wars were probably most familiar to Europe for the hundreds of years as nation states were forming here. Why are we so shocked all of a sudden at what that is and means? And I'll conclude with a few policy recommendations, which you may agree to or you may not. And that's fine, because one of my purposes wherever I go is to say things that are provocative. I may agree with most of the things I say, I may not, but I want to provoke some, because I want some reaction. I want to know as well what you think and if I am on a correct path, especially when you begin to ask me, well, what does this mean for Europe? Can I say that's not my area of expertise and move on? Probably not. So I want to speak more to the reality than the aspirational, but I think you'll see as I get along. Of course, nothing is perfect. Well, obviously nothing is perfect because, look, I sent the wrong first slide. That still has the old title. Don't pay attention to that. What I wanted to do, you know who that is. That's Assad. Now think a few minutes about contradictions and connections. And if you're not confused when I finish with this, I've probably done something wrong. Anyway, what do we have here? The United States. What do you see? Oh, good. You see that. See, I see President Assad. And we obviously oppose the President Assad, and we support the next slide. There we go. This is great. It works perfectly. We support the moderate resistance, whatever moderate means. Don't challenge me yet. You can later. And we oppose the extremists. There they are, the black flag. Both of which are fighting the Assad regime. Did that come up with the connections? Yes. Wow, this is good. The next one, Iran. Iran supports Assad, of course, and Iran definitely does not like any of the Syrian resistance movements, including the extremists we oppose, including the moderates, and I'm not even sure where we are in the moderate front, to tell you the truth, and I will be candid with you. But as I read policy as of this weekend, we're going to find new moderates because we didn't like the old ones. Free Syrian army, well, we're not sure that's going to work, so we're going to find something that's kind of silly, but never mind. So, where have I gotten? Iran opposes all the resistance groups, and now I've lost my place already. Okay. Did I bring in the GCC states? Yes, there's all their little flags. Right. So we are close to the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council states, all 6 of them. And they, of course, oppose Iran. They oppose Assad. They oppose a Shia-led Iraq. They support, my God, which is that? That's Iraq, of course. And they oppose, I'm a little ahead of myself. They oppose, they oppose Assad and Iran. They don't like Shia-dominated Iraq. They support Syrian resistance groups, including some of the extremists that we oppose. Or maybe they don't. It's not really clear. Is it the state or is it individuals? And what's your point? But the GCC states support, and the U.S. support, whereas they don't support, for example, Iraq, we do. And that's a running argument we have had with them now since, in terms of what policy should be for a long time. Where are we now? I can't find the numbers, so it's a little hard to tell me. There are things that have not been mentioned. That's where I am. And let me do that. I will go in a little bit to Turkey, which does and doesn't support the Kurds. It supports, depends what day of the week you're on. Today they support helping in Kobane, but they didn't yesterday. I don't know what they'll do tomorrow, and that's been par for the course, where they have supported tacitly and openly ISIS, not recognized terrorist organizations who are part of the opposition, and then they did. So Turkey's a little hard. I'll talk a bit more about that. They did not protect many of the groups in Iraq that they had promised to, especially the Turkmen, who now don't like them. They have supported and not supported the Kurds. Complicated set of issues there, which we will get to. What about Israel? Gee, I don't have to talk much about Israel. And there's so much to talk about that I don't have, I will not put a lot of time, but I will make a bit of a mention to point out that they love and encourage the Iraqi side of Kurdistan. They sell arms. They built their airfields. They've done a lot in terms of assistance, agricultural and otherwise. But if the Kurdish regional government declared its independence, would they be there to support and defend them? I think it's an important question. They may be there. They may be not. They've also bought Kurdish oil, one of the few who have. Now, what about, again, there are things that we just don't have time to, but that get involved if you look at the periphery. What about Lebanon? What about the threat there, spillover? What about Hezbollah, which is so is so involved in Syria and so committed to the survival of Assad that it may not be able to fend off the threat that is growing to it in Lebanon from al-Nusra and other of the ISIS type opposition groups. I'll get back to Egypt. No one remembers the Palestinians. Yemen is so busy in its own civil war, they're probably saying, don't bother us, we can't follow what's going on in the rest of your world anyway. So this is complicated. But it takes us back to that man at the end. Is he there? No. There he is, the man at the end, Assad. Why is this man smiling? Some people think that he's winning because, after all, we're going to get rid of his enemies for him, and maybe we should be helping, and we still... It's part of a complicated issue on policies. I thought maybe because there's so many interpretations of what's going on in the Middle East today. One of the, I think, the most popular ones, at least here, must be the soccer interpretation of Middle Eastern politics. Are you familiar with that? There is a scholar who's working out of Shanghai. He's European of some kind who interprets everything through the prism of soccer. It's the paradigm by which he explains all the conflicts, civil war, sectarianism, all in terms of soccer and what that could mean. I won't bore you with it, but I think maybe Assad is smiling because Manchester United is winning. But that's the only soccer team's name I remember, so don't worry about that. Now, for tonight's presentation, the question I was given, what's the West strategy for the Middle East? Well, I said that's an interesting question, but it's a little bit dated. It's the kind of question you would have asked in 1916. Certainly was the primary question at the peace conference in 1919. Remember, Sykes-Picot, it comes back to haunt you. But I'm not really sure that we should be asking, at least that way, what does the West, what does the United States want from the Middle East? One could say that beyond the threat of terrorism, of returning fighters who've gone to or are in Iraq and Syria, have gotten the experience and can now come back to Europe or can come to the U.S. This is the threat. I don't know. You'll have to judge that. First of all, you're closer to the issue. Maybe we're more worried about that than we should be. It's a little hard to tell. Right now, everything has been pushed off the screen by the Ebola scare anyway. So it's a little hard to tell how worried, but I think it clearly is a worry. And I think it goes back to the fact that we at home haven't gotten over 9/11. And I think there's a part of the U.S. historical memory, such as it is, that won't. You have had scares in Europe, both in Spain especially, and in England, where there were major threats. So maybe, there is something that is more real. But the problem is that there are costs for what is happening in the region, both to relations between us, the West, and the United States, and each other. And there are questions of how it will impact on other issues that are negotiations that are going on at the same time. In other words, until now, there are issues, and I'm thinking especially of the Iran-U.S. or the P5+1 nuclear issues, which have been kept entirely isolated from everything else because both countries wanted it that way. All of a sudden, we have one of those issues which touches on everything else, and how could one be used to help shape or influence or as leverage on the other? So, as I said, hard to isolate. Now, to come back to my the broader question first. Are borders important? Is Sykes-Picot relevant? Well, of course, borders are important. And even though the Islamic Caliphate has said there are no more borders, there's always going to be a border of some kind. I don't want to waste a lot of time in looking at that. I don't also know where I'm going here. Yes. We'll just let that sit a minute. When I get to Iraq, we'll get there. Now, all right, that's better. If you look at what's happened, if I just touch on, for example, the brief period of the Arab Spring, which I mentioned is one of the introductory, the overarching issues. There were great hopes in the region and in the West that this was going to be the coming of democracy, the voice of people in politics. If you have elections, you'll have democracy, right? And what we saw was the great optimism of 2011 and 2012, for the most part, has given way to the acceptance of the idea that if you're going to have order and stability, we are looking at, in effect, what's happened in Egypt, the worst possible case, Syria, what's happened in Bahrain, and what seems to be happening in most of the other countries, even in Turkey, which I'll get to in a minute. And that's this issue of the people who made the revolutions, who were in Tahrir Square and at the forefront of the changes, whether it was Tunisia or Egypt or many other countries that had hopes, disappeared quite quickly. The so-called the moderates, the liberals, the women, the students, the secularists, whose first call, all of which was for secular institution of secular state, secular governance, and for the cooperation, not sectarian, but for the participation of all elements. You remember the pictures in Egypt of the Copts and the Muslims together, and everybody was in the streets. And a lot of this was happening in other areas as well, but it was short-lived. That soon we saw the public I didn't want to say resurgence, but the reappearance of the Muslim Brotherhood in a way that was not allowed publicly in most of these countries, and that was especially true in, well, almost every country had a Muslim Brotherhood chapter anyway, but certainly Tunisia and Egypt, and Turkey has Muslim Brotherhood in its origins of its AK party, but the point again being that the revolution in its beginnings was taken over. There was a lot of chaos, and as the Muslim Brotherhood especially came to power in Egypt, it looked like it would in Tunisia as well, and there were more demonstrations and chaos, and the implementation of Islamist law, which was certainly not expected. It created an opposition that set aside the gains that were made by the Islamists. The point I want to make here is not so much those gains, but the fact that it introduced elements and fears of instability, fears of chaos, and a desire for order and simplicity, which meant in many of these countries a return to strongman rule. It enabled the military. You have to have a general, remember, if you're going to have order. And we soon found we had Supreme Commander General Sisi in charge in Egypt, welcomed by those who had supported the Arab Spring, because what were they afraid of? They were afraid of more violence, afraid of change. And what this draws me to, just in short, oh, and by the way, I noticed Tunisia's having its elections. Tunisia is supposedly one of the few remaining hopes for democratic governance, that almost all the candidates running for election, which is what, in another week or so, come from the former regime. They were all Ben Ali appointees or connections in the old days. Same thing happened in Egypt, where and in these other countries, where you wait long enough and you will see familiar faces and familiar parties reemerge, except in the countries where they've been killed, of course. But you know, life is uncertain in a revolution. So what I'm trying to say, I'd like to point out that there have been two trends that have been noticed by scholars recently, and that first one is that whereas in most of these countries, after all, Islam is the religion of what, 90% or more, 95% of the peoples in most of these Middle Eastern countries, there is a wide acceptance of the role of Sharia in public life, in law. Even though one wanted a secular government, many of those people would be willing to accept elements of Sharia law in everyday life. The second point is the great anxiety that exists at the same time if more Islam and if strict Islamist precepts were to come in, all of which spells fear of the future, and a desire to return to something simpler. I'm reminded in a way, it's a personal story. I have a son who once fancied himself he'd be a historian when he grew up. We thought he'd be a scientist. But he entered this, I think he was 13 or 14, and entered this national contest for young on history. And his choice of topic was what Stalin had done that was good. Thinking back that, there were some good things. Not everyone is all bad. And I said, Andrew, I don't think you understand. There are a lot of people still alive who don't quite see Stalin in the same historical perspective you do. And of course he didn't win, and he was crushed. But how do you explain when many, if you remember after Stalin died and the turmoil in the Soviet Union, how many people would say, for the good old days under Stalin. In Iraq, with Saddam gone, and the civil wars, and the chaos, and the violence that marked the years from 2004 on, the good old days with when Saddam was here, and at least you knew what the threat was. You knew what the danger was. I mean, in a way, it's probably a national reaction, is all that I'm saying. When my son the next year worked on Galileo, he won the first prize. It's much safer, I think the lesson is, to go back several hundred years if you're looking for a hero in history, perhaps, or a model to follow. Maybe not the best example, but I thought it fit at the time. Now, let me turn very briefly, because I want to get on to some other issues. If you look at the changes in Turkey, you might wonder, I do, where Turkey is going. I think we've seen with Erdogan a lot of going in two different paths at the same time. The neo-Ottomanist solution. People are very selective about their memories of history. Americans remember the best parts, if we remember history at all, quite frankly. Europeans will tend to look back on the national stories, the national experiences that were more positive. The Turks like to look on the Ottoman period as the time when our part of Europe, the empire, was secure and peaceful and safe, and there was stability. They're looking at it from an Ottoman-Turkish perspective, not from the Balkan perspective or the Greek or anybody else that only saw the oppression and the occupation. Selective. So it looked for a while that if that was part of it, that the Turks were looking to cooperate. You remember that period, what was it, zero problems with the neighbors? That's gone. Is Erdogan playing is he playing with what we say in America, a full deck? Is he playing a sectarian card? Is he playing with the Kurds? One day he wants Kurdish support because he's got an election coming. The next day, he doesn't seem to care about it. He's managed to alienate the Turkish Kurds whose support he wanted, and he's managed, I think, to frighten in a way the Iraqi Kurds whose support he's been trying to gain in order to help him in his own elections, not understanding that the Iraqi Kurds aren't really popular with the Syrian Kurds or anybody else. We've been trying to encourage him, because of ISIS, to join our coalition of the willing. There's history for you. We in the United States remember the great 1990 Coalition of the Willing. Can't we do that again? Can't we repeat 2006 and 2007 when, through our coalition with the Iraqi willing, we were able to form the solution to defeating al-Qaeda in Iraq? Well, anyway, Erdogan has played both sides and has not been willing to cooperate, although I think as of this weekend he said he would. Last weekend he wouldn't. He's got a religious agenda, a Muslim Brotherhood agenda, which offends a lot of Turks. So when I look at that, I see that he may be failing, and maybe that's why he's been hesitant to make a decision, that he may have lost. If I'm right, and I'm not a Turkish specialist, but if a fifth of the population of Turkey is Kurdish, the major cities are certainly Kurdish, Istanbul and Ankara, heavily Kurdish population. If that is true, he may have lost a lot of Kurdish support in Turkey. His refusal to help the Syrian Kurds, which we are doing, his refusal to stop assisting ISIS, which is fighting the Syrian Kurds, very confusing, but the point is he knows full well that a large percentage of the Syrian Kurds are also pro-PKK, one of his two favorite, most serious enemies as he sees it. The other being Fethullah Gulen, and I don't understand that at all, but except that that opposition is hard to explain when you think of the other threats facing him. But the point is, he has alienated, I think, a large percentage of his potential support inside and next door, because it would have been a bonus for him to have a compliant entity, Kurdish, whether they were independent or not, on his border. And some think he may be losing his Alawi population, which is also, according to some of the figures I've read, maybe as high as a fifth of the total population. So there's some serious risks here, and some say he won't realize his own internal ambitions, which is to have a powerful presidency and to really change the system. I don't know, but again, I promised especially to touch on Egypt, to touch on Turkey. That's going to have to be enough of a touch, because the point is to draw them together, to show how it gets involved in the great issue which has brought them together, which is Iraq, which is ISIS, and which is their involvement in the security issue. Which brings me again to the third of that triad, which is Iran. Not so simple, no longer one issue focused in terms of its relations with Europe or the United States. It's not just about the nuclear negotiations and the removal of sanctions. I don't know. It is about those things, but it's also about the growing threat that Iran faces, because it's the shift in the balance of power, which it was enjoying and may still, has shifted. No longer is it sure of what will happen in Syria. Some people will say that because the Iranians have shown great flexibility in Iraq, that they were willing, when it came to the bottom line, to give up on Prime Minister Maliki, who they supported, because they saw that support for him was costing them more than they gained. That perhaps that lesson to be learned would be applied by them to Syria, if they saw that support for Assad was costing them more than they could afford. If it was costing Hezbollah, one of their primary allies, more than it could afford to expend in the Syrian effort, that they would give up on him and seek a compromise candidate while being able to retain their interests in Syria. Well, they haven't made clear that that is a possibility at all. But what we do have, I think, is an added determination to persist and see the solution they want in Syria, again, where we don't agree with them, but we do share interests with them in Iraq. Now, I think that, again, Iran understands all too well where the dangers lie. When they see Iraq, it has become, in effect, their strategic, their search for what is called strategic, not parity, but a strategic border. That's their defense, their first line of defense in forming a strategic policy. If Iraq cannot stop this threat, then what happens to Iran? You may think that Iran is not at risk. Surely the Islamic Caliphate would not be foolish enough to try to attack a state like Iran. Iraq, that's one thing. It was easy. Parts of it were. But Iran, after all, isn't that a bit much? I don't know. I learned a long time ago when I started out as an intelligence analyst a long time ago, and the Lebanese Civil War was going on, that's a clue, that you never say never, because you cannot predict what a nation, what a country, what a tribe, what an insurgents group will do. We have seen things happen, especially in the past decade or more, that one certainly could never anticipate. So, without saying never, I would not predict quite what Iran would do, but I do see that what happens in Iraq will reflect very much on Iran. The legitimacy of the Iranian government, especially on the supreme leader and on the Islamic Revolution, depends very much on its support for, well, in the Iranian context, they say Islam, especially Islam, at risk worldwide. What they really see is especially their support for the Shia community, the besieged Shia community. If they are not there to support the Iraqi Shia, if they are not there to support Najaf and Karbala and this investment that they have made there, then they, in my own opinion, lose a lot of credibility. They've built up a huge investment there, as well as their legitimacy. I think that that would be something they could ill afford to lose, which also raises a question in my own mind is, why haven't they done more? Now, understand, it's not exactly easy to know all of what they've done, but I think it is, or it should be assumed that they have a lot invested there and have been doing that since the day Saddam fell. I'll come back to that in a few minutes. But the civil war in Syria, the coming of ISIS, and the rapid the pace at which they virtually conquered 1/3 of Iraq so quickly and with such great ease has to have frightened many people. Now, there are reasons for that simple success, but again, what you need to think about, and it's something I came back to in the beginning, what this pushes out of the way. What you don't discuss when all you focus on are these major crises. The Palestinians feel they don't matter anymore. The Israelis seem to think that they can act with greater impunity than they had to think about, especially since Gaza. And they have just announced 2 tranches of expansion of settlements in East Jerusalem, and I think broader in the occupied territories. We're not going to talk anywhere about water. Who has the time when you have to talk about ISIS, which is using water as one of its weapons in Iraq? But we can, of course, talk about what the caliphate means and how that threatens us. And isn't it interesting? I don't know about you, but if people follow the price of oil, another thing you're not worried about is the price of oil, which has gone down. It is now, what, at least in the United States, it's down to the lowest price it's been in a year and a half. And I don't think that the market doesn't seem to be terribly nervous about that. Isn't that amazing? Well, now let me move over to, having totally confused you, with all of these different variables. Think of the Middle East as an equation with so many variables. Let's get back to some of the prime factors. Now, I am thinking about the crisis that doesn't really begin in 2013. It's 2013 when we become aware of all that is happening. We're in the civil war in Syria and in the spillover, which we've been warning about, and then all of a sudden it seems we see it, because it's in December 2013 that ISIS, or ISIL, we're supposed to say ISIL, I guess. I don't work for the government. I don't care what the government says. I like the term Daesh, if I could use that. It's what the region uses, and I think it's correct. Comes to everybody's attention because they take Fallujah. How did they get there? Well, they were always there, you would say. And then we see, within a 6-month period, by June of 2013, they have come across the border, the Daesh units, and we begin to understand with the great rapidity. They take Mosul with a very small force, what, a couple of trucks, a couple hundred soldiers. It looks so simple. Well, it wasn't all that complicated, but what made it so easy was who they had become. And the Iraqi group that is known as ISIL or Daesh is primarily Iraqi. The group in Syria, that is al-Nusra, or the ISIS in Syria, is primarily, you can talk there about the Syrian base and about all the foreign fighters, but there aren't as many foreign fighters in Iraq. And if you look at the structure or what we know it, I actually have a slide on this. By the way, I just wanted to, I don't know how many of you are interested in following daily events of the war, but there is a group in the United States that looks at, it's the, oh, yes, no, that's the displaced, but they look at that as well. They look at the progress being made each day in, well, never mind. This map is one of them, but this shows displaced Iraqis. Every day they're putting out a series of maps. The ones that I'm talking about show the place where the incidents, the major security incidents, happened in the last 24 to 48 hours. And you can see where ISIS or Daesh has power, where the Iraqi army is, where the Kurds are, and they do this almost on a day-by-day basis. The maps are so small you can barely see the print on them. But it's called the Institute for War and Peace. Their website is called, I think, Understanding War. And you can get a data dump every day on the conflict in Syria and the conflict on Iraq, and special treats like this one, which is on the percentage for each province of Iraqis that have been displaced, either as refugees or as IDPs, internally displaced. It's a huge number. What do we have now? That's Syria. Why can't, okay. This is a sort of a breakdown. I'll come back to ISIS and the Caliph in a minute. There's an ISIS org. Whoa, that's cute. This is an org chart that some have come up with, and pictures, if you can see them. I know it's kind of small, sorry about that. My technological skills are a little bit limited in terms of what to do with this. But I think the point is that this is the first time you have an organization that has done what? It's eliminated borders, it's taken control 1/3 of Iraq. First time an Islamic terrorist faction has acquired territory, declared an independent state, and, by the way, declared a global jihad, global caliphate. So what does that tell you that their ultimate goal might be? Once we take Damascus, once we take Baghdad, there are people who believe that Mecca will be the next stop. I think that the Gulf Arabs believe that they've been targeted. Certainly Kuwait has. Certainly even the Saudis don't feel comfortable about it. But nobody knows where they will stop. For Iraq, for Iran, and for, I think, these neighbors, this has become an existential crisis of the worst order. It explains a lot of why the new Iraqi government is being so cooperative and so willing to bring in so many, what I would call dead politicians, into the government to do anything for the sake of unity, because without a real and effective united front, you could see the breakup. Well, anyway, the goal, as I said, eliminating along the way most Muslims. Certainly if you are a Sunni Muslim, you're fairly safe. Remember, most of the tribes, most of the ethnic groups are Sunni and they are Shia. If you're a Sunni Kurd, you're probably going to be safe. If you're a Sunni Turkmen, you're probably going to be safe. If you're a Shia Kurd, you won't be. If you're a Shia anything, you will not be. One of the tribes that borders, many of these tribes in northern Iraq, the Shamar, the Obaid, and many others, the Janabi, they cover many countries. They are in Saudi, they are in Iraq, they are in Syria, they are in Lebanon. They have Sunni and Shia components, and they are the ones that are sort of feeding a lot of this. My point being that if you look at the organization, many of the people that are the senior bureaucrats who are managing this organization, doing the targeting, the military planning, and running the bureaucracy are Iraqis who are former or may still be Baathists. You can be a religious Sunni and be a Baathist, by the way. Saddam allowed that, especially in the 1990s and a little bit earlier as well, as long as you weren't crazy, because he didn't like the extremists, he didn't like the Brotherhood, he certainly didn't like any of these organizations, no matter what the Bush administration claimed. But the issue is that these Iraqi Baathists joined with Al-Qaeda, many of these tribes, in 2005 and 6. Why? Because they felt that they were marginalized, they had been, they were being ignored, they were the object of increasing frustration, if not risk. We started that in part, well, we didn't start it, this kind of, the differences, ethnic sectarian differences were always there, but in 2003 we set up supposedly a government based on, if you've got 55% of the population is Shia Arab, you will be 13 members of the 25-member governing council that Mr. Bremer set up. If your population is 20% Sunni Arab, you're going to get 5 on it. You're 20% Kurd, you're going to have 5, and Turkmen will get 1. I mean, it was to be this mathematical model. For that, we are blamed as contributing to sectarianism. I'm not so sure that's a fair hit, a fair attack, because if you look to what happens, the structure of post-Saddam Iraq, the structure is going to be defined very much by the winners, just like the history of war is written by the winners. The national mythology, the national stories or history is written by the winners. And you're going to find that de-Baathification and the elimination, the firing of the army and the security forces, in other words, the elimination of 450,000 jobs and positions, those that were in the military, both the regular and in the Republican Guard and the security services, that's huge. And it targeted the Sunnis. De-Baathification also did, even though there were Shia who were in the military and Shia who were in the party, it is not those Shia who necessarily paid a price. Many of them didn't pay a price. It depended on connections. But to be a Sunni and to have that charged against you was, in effect, I didn't want to say a death sentence, but it meant marginalization. It meant you wouldn't hold a job. It meant discrimination. And it drove many of the Sunni Arabs into the hands of Al-Qaeda briefly, until they saw by 2006 that really joining with Al-Qaeda was dangerous, that instead of getting them somewhere, that Al-Qaeda was trying to control them, was trying to take their wealth, their power, their authority, also their families, their daughters, and their property. Not too good. And you get from that the Sahwa, the awakening. Some people in the United States, we like to think it was the great success of General Petraeus. We know it wasn't. That this was a mutual understanding, cooperation with the Sunni tribes who agreed to fight with us, with the Iraqis, against Al-Qaeda. They were defeated. We made promises. Maliki agreed to reward them with positions, with salaries. He reneged. He refused. He refused to share power, which led us to much of what has happened, to the second crisis, where still dissatisfied, still, what's the word I want? Marginalized, great word, let's use it again, find themselves in the hands of joining with, once again, extremist elements. You might think they had learned from their first experience with Al-Qaeda wasn't a good idea. Sometimes you never learn. They feel joining with the new Islamists, I don't think they foresaw what would be the next stages. I think they believed that they would be able to protect their interests, protect their property, make their contribution, but I don't think they were ever interested, I still don't think they are, in a separate independent state. But you know the mistake you make when you bring in some kind of an outsider, you think he's extremist, but hey, we can control him. And the next thing you know, he is in charge and he's controlling you. Does this sound familiar in Europe? I don't want to go further than that, but you get what I'm talking about. My point, again, it was easy for the ISIL to overrun so much of Iraq because who was helping them? They had the support and the active engagement of former Iraqi officers who knew how to fight. Everyone's armed anyway. They know how to use the weapons they got a hold of. They knew the targeting, what to target, how to take over, and probably the main thing is they knew the areas that they were going into where there was a receptive and supportive population. You go into Mosul, you go into the areas where the Sunni Arab tribes are dominant, and it means something to be a sheikh there, to be dominant. Then the local population welcomes you, which is what happened. It's what happened in Mosul. It's what happened in many of those areas that the ISIS could overrun so easily and so quickly. Now, the other point, if you are interested, there's a lot about this organization which appeals to very conservative Sunni fundamentalists. There's a lot of elements of Wahhabism in what they're doing. I'm talking too long already. But simply say that there are elements in terms of practices, the strictness of the concepts, a belief in takfir. If you're not appropriately observant of the Prophet's customs of the Quran, if you are not perfectly obedient to their interpretation, and they're not clerics, then, like the Wahhabis of the 18th century, like other caliphate efforts, you're an apostate. Shias, by definition, are apostates, and therefore should be killed. They believe in activist jihad. They are jihadis. They believe in warfare because after all, we all live, the world is divided into the Dar al-Harb, the abode of war, and the Dar al-Islam, where we live, the good Muslims. So because of the acceptability, the familiarity, and who is this new caliph? He comes in terms of presenting himself in traditional Islamic symbols, history, traditions. He's a descendant of the Quraysh. He believes in all of the practices. He wants to destroy, just like the Wahhabis, he wants to destroy all this. Does this make him a Wahhabi? Because he wants to destroy their shrines. He says you must convert if you're a Christian. There are no Jews there, so it doesn't matter about the dhimmis or the protected people or paying special taxes. But this is going back to the Islamist practice at the time of the Prophet. Appeals to a certain mentality. And, by the way, we're no longer have to feel oppressed. But I think that at the heart of a lot of this is a bid for a way to get power and recognition and leverage. Not a separate state. To be a separate state would be to be weak and dependent. I don't think that any of these Iraqi groups want it. So here we are. What do these Iraqis want? Now, I would give you, there are options. I think somehow the windows for these options may be narrowing, but let me give it to you in terms of options. There's a 1, 2, 3, or 0 state solution. One state solution is what we sort of still have now. Iraq stays together. It means that the Kurds forego giving up their search for de jure independence. They haven't talked a lot about it lately. But it means that they're able to cut a deal with Baghdad, which is desperate because its existential crisis is survival. okay, the Kurds want recognition of those disputed territories that they occupied the day after Mosul fell. Well, that was a little greedy, wasn't it? Well, and that's one of the problems. As soon as ISIS was successful and the Iraqi army collapsed and ran, what did the Kurds do? They sent the Peshmerga into the 4 provinces that are disputed territories that they insist are Kurdish and that the Arabs of Iraq insist, because everybody lives there. They're the ones that have the mixed populations. So the Kurds, instead of fighting the threat that's coming in, which makes it look a little suspicious of collusion, they turn and they send the Peshmerga to occupy those 4 provinces. We only did it for protection. I don't know. It looks opportunistic, but what's Baghdad going to do? There's not much they can do, so Mali says, okay, yeah, well, protect them. That's fine. But he's got no choice. But I don't think that's long term. But if the Kurds feel they've got a concession on that, and a concession on selling oil, and concessions on getting the budget money, that's a lot of stuff. And now they have 6 cabinet members. They're getting everything they want. Maybe that's enough to give them a deal so that they stay in the state, the one Iraq state, for a while, and everybody then focuses their attention on defeating ISIS. Because what do the Kurds see? That they are threatened by the Islamic Caliphate or the ISIL or ISIS, whatever. You could have a 2-state solution. The Kurds separate. This assumes, I think, that maybe the Sunni Arabs that the wedge strategy might work, and the Sunni Arabs will come back, and Arabism, Iraqism, because I do believe there is an Iraqi nationalism that both have, that this will bring them together. They don't like what the Kurds have done, and they may feel betrayed by what ISIL, they don't like the caliphate and the restrictions and the encroachments that's now taking over their lives, just like Al-Qaeda tried to do. So they will perhaps join. You will have a 2-state solution because the Kurds have declared independence, but I don't think they'll get much out of that. What I think you see is Shia and the Sunnis drawing on their history of loyalty to the state, their identity as Arabs, resentment of the Kurds. I don't think the Kurds will get recognition for their independence, and what you will have is ongoing war. Now, this one lends itself most easily to the next ultimate stage of the war, which maybe the first one does as well, which is that if you can get rid of the Islamic Caliphate, what's left? I think at some point in the fullness of time, you then are looking at an Arab-Kurdish war, unless they are able to resolve their differences, which means that the Kurds would have to really make concessions at that point. There could be a 3-state solution, Sunnistan, Iraq, Shiistan, Kurdistan. I don't think so. Why? In this scenario, you have 3 very weak states, each one of which would be dependent for survival on a neighbor, an outside power, for access to almost everything. The only one that could possibly survive would be the Shia state, because it has a supportive neighbor, Iran, which I don't think wants to take it over, by the way. They don't get along doctrinally and on a lot of other issues, but Iran would certainly be able to control all of their policies in a way that it has not been able to yet, including oil. But Turkey would benefit because it would have a weak neighbor. The Sunnis would have to look to an outside supporter. The Kurds would be dependent, and the Kurds would be totally landlocked, as would the Sunnis. So what does independence give you? Not much. That's why I think that that's not going to work. You could have, the last one, the 0-state solution. No state, but just permanent chaos, permanent civil war. I don't think that's a solution either. What has impressed me in a way is that the Iraqis have always been able to work on a solution just when you think they're about to commit national suicide. Now, in all of this, let me point out that, as I said in the beginning, Syria is a difficult issue for both us and the Iranians. The nuclear negotiations, who knows if they're going to work or not? I think that something will come out of it. But in Iraq, it's pretty clear We have common interests. We don't want to see the caliphate succeed. We don't want to see Iraq fail. We may not want to see the same Iraq that Iran wants to see, and Iran wants to see a state which is weak but united, which has a government. Of course, it should reflect the Shia majority. That's what democracy is all about, right? But it should also be a government that is friendly to Iran, that will not fight with it, won't go to war with it, and will support whatever policies the Iranians are interested in. Now, at some point, the Iranians will come back someday and say, we want reparations for the Iran-Iraq war, we want this, we want this oil field. Well, you know, if they're foolish enough to do that, that's a separate issue. They have done that in what they've raised them as hints. But I don't think that that's in the cards. So, on a public level, the Iranians don't want the United States in Iraq. They certainly will not cooperate. The Shia militias, which Ayatollah Sistani has called out, come back into the streets and fight because we need you. After many of the militias, they'd never gone away, but they had been controlled more. Certainly the Mehdi army of Muqtada Sadr had. They're now back, supported by the Iranians, and the issue of how you're going to control them if there is peace is a serious one. But the point I wanted to make is that this war is going on. They also oppose any American involvement there, and no boots on the ground for sure. Well, hey, that's something that President Obama agrees with. Now, having said that on the surface, you know, what you see and what you get are two different things, especially in dealing with Iran. There's policy, and then there's practice. Well, that's not only true of Iran, but I think what we see here is I do believe that Iran has been so entrenched in Iraq for so long. You just don't eliminate it. And I believe that what has happened now, even though many Iraqis have been uncomfortable, I think increasingly uncomfortable, with the level of control and influence that Iran has had in Iraq, including with the militias, with the police, with every politician, with the politics. You know, it's not just the Shia that Iran has influence with. Every Sunni politician who wants to succeed, every Kurdish politician who wants to win an election goes off to Iran to ask for their advice. Everyone is a friend of Qasem Soleimani, probably the most brilliant general that the Iranians have, who's been in charge of Iran's Syria as well as its Iraqi military strategy. He heads the Quds Force, very senior in the IRGC, and is showing up a lot in Iraq. Now, some suspect, I suspect it strongly, there is a level of cooperation or a tacit collusion on the ground. Not joint forces, but I think that there is cooperation. There has to be. We're in the same places, in the same areas, fighting the same target. It would be hard not to be. But that's not the kind of thing that the revolutionary Islamic Republic can talk about, or that we can talk about either, because of the kinds of elements that both governments, both in Iran and in the United States, face, whether it's the nuclear negotiations or cooperation on almost every level. It's hard for politicians to talk about it. But I think what we have to think about is Iran was the first country when the Iraqis screamed for help. When the Kurds asked for assistance, the Iranians were the first to be there with assistance, military assistance, meaningful military assistance. That is significant. Now, having said that, I also have a corollary belief that sometime in the fullness of time, Iraq's influence will decline. But to do that, you're going to have a coherent Iraq, an Iraq that is more united. You're going to have the different elements back together, and an Iraq that can stand on its own. And I think the best example is I don't think that Maliki was so incredibly pro-Iranian, a tool of Iran. And I think that's going to be said of a body. Anybody who governs in Baghdad has to be pro-Iranian, if only because there is no choice. You can't be anything else. Iran is there. It's an open border. They have troops. They have the elements of the Republican Guard, and the dead bodies are starting to go home. Not many, maybe, but they're taking casualties, and for them it is a serious effort. That's why I say I don't understand why they haven't done more. I think I do understand that they can't afford to. I'm wrapping up now. Okay? So there is a conjunction here. Some would say if we really want Iran to cooperate, we could meet them halfway in Syria. We could include them in Syrian talks, discussions, just like they were included in the 6+2 for Afghanistan. Anybody remember Afghanistan? Yeah. And I don't know if that's true or not. The Iranians have complained that they're not included right now in what's being talked about as the next round of Geneva negotiations with all the Syrians. Well, nobody's talking about it, quite frankly. So I frankly doubt it's going to happen. I don't, as I said in the beginning, if we're now talking about creating another new Free Syrian Army, an opposition, there isn't time. But I don't see an end in sight to what is happening there either. I do think that both Syria and Iraq are going to be around for a long time. And both of these crises are going to involve everyone. So let me give you a few conclusions to chew on, and then I'll be happy to take your questions. I think what we have to do, and I think this is true for Europe and the United States, is to look for ways to cooperate with the regional players to ensure that Iraq remains a united and independent state and is able to succeed against the caliphate, this Islamic State. They have not had cooperation from their neighbors from the time Saddam fell. The Saudis in particular and the Gulf states, except for Kuwait, have withheld any kind of diplomatic relations or inclusion in regional discussions or talks. A lot of that was personal. King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia did not like Maliki, whom he felt had insulted him, but I think we had been telling him, I always made a point of it in my small capacity, that you have a small window of opportunity to turn Iraq in a direction that will be to your advantage and not become the Iran puppet you're describing or you're predicting. Well, they didn't take my advice. Darn, they should have. But the point is that they have not been willing to do that. Now there is an opportunity with a body and with the Islamist extremists who threatened them as well. I think that the pressure will continue on the United States not to link Iraq policy to Syria policy. Can that be done? Can you do it and wipe the smile off Assad's face? I don't know. That's a good question. But I cannot see the American administration, regardless of who it is, accepting to live with Assad after all that has been experienced, the high price that the Syrians, everyone will have paid. I think we have to define our regional security interests and policy more broadly than just being about counter-terrorist cooperation. If we're going to have a new policy, you can't just make it a policy based on getting rid of ISIL, on defeating the caliphate. It's got to be more than that. It's got to be built on a more solid foundation. And I think that's true for Europe as well as for the United States. And here I think is where one of the places that we did fall down. We did not strongly enough intervene or encourage the Maliki government to pursue national reconciliation and to stop the divisive measures that furthered sectarianism and the establishment of what looked like the new Saddam state by making the military and much of the bureaucracy totally dependent on the figure of Maliki himself. Personal control of everything. Bad. We should have kept our commitments, certainly to the Sunni Arabs. Finally, what I would urge, at least of my own government, and yours as well, not to rush to abandon Iraq again when the current crisis is over. If they win, but if they lose, we have a really serious problem at stake. It won't go away if they lose, but if they win, we just can't say, great, been there, done that, we're going home. Thank you for your patience.